Okay, well, the host has it. So today we're going to talk about food farming and justice. That's the name of the series. And it's just an introduction to the ecosystem of growing food. This isn't going to be super in-depth. And I took a lot of things out, even in this one, just so that we can focus more on the concepts and people can learn the best that they can. So this session might even be a little shorter than the other ones. So to start, I created this graphic because I know people said that they wanted examples. I tried to do as many real life ones as I could. But I figured just having some kind of creature, like some kind of a person or example here for you would be helpful. So throughout this series, we will follow Farmer May, who is a fictional producer, but she's based on real life experiences. And so to get to know this fictional farmer, for 5 years, Farmer May has owned and acted as the principal operator and owner of, well, that's Farmer May, of Juneberry Farms. And Dewberry Farms is a 2-acre organic, no-till New York State farm that produces dozens of pounds of free and reduced price flowers and vegetables to a Long Island community. Farmer May will appear as our ongoing example, as I said before, as we dive into several different topics, and those topics include agriculture in farming terms, agricultural practices, site assessment, calming plant problems, food systems justice, which is really the main topic of today, farm ecosystems, basic plant care, and if it makes sense, just based on how people are feeling and what we can cover, we might even get into plant ID. That's why I put it as bonus. As we get into each of these topics, though, we're always going to start with an overview, not always a series overview, but just an overview of what to expect of the day, as well as a summary of what we've done before, which will start next session since this is our first one. And I'll likely start off with a poll everywhere question, or sometimes it's a little further into the presentation like today. And then I'll ask you questions along the way with it so that you can answer them, and it could be more engaging of an experience. And if you have any questions during it, try to put it in the chat, or you can raise your hand using the raise hand feature because I can't see everyone at once. And then we'll finish off each lesson with a short quiz. Most of these quizzes I think will be automatically grading it, but sometimes I'm going to try to do some that I grade after the fact just so I can have more short answer types questions. And again, I'll give you the preview of the next session until the last day. Does that sound good to everyone? Does anyone have any questions about that? Okay, seems like everyone's good. All right, so let's get into this. So part 1, the power of definitions. So as I mentioned a few times, today's lesson is focused a lot on defining some key agricultural terms, but it's also focused on starting to understand their relevance to and importance in food systems work. So starting with defining food systems. So the National Agricultural Library says that food systems at their most basic are systems including everything from farm to table. So that's encompassing a lot. So contrary to how I've often seen and heard about food systems and how they're described, they are not linear. Every part influences another, requiring inputs like sunlight to produce outputs like fully grown corn, let's say. And food systems will vary from location to location over time. And when we put all these pieces together, we get this complex and cyclical system like the one that's represented in this graphic on the left-hand side of the screen. And this graphic, although very informative, is a lot to take in, I'd imagine. And I also have it pretty small. So I'm just going to break it down a little bit into something much simpler like this graphic here. But because it's a breakdown of something that's more complicated, it may be missing a little bit, and I tried to summarize as best as possible. So if we want to think of these food systems more crudely, there are 6 parts to it that continuously feed into one another. So you have production, which will be like growing things like our Farmer May. You'll have processing, so once things are grown, being able to turn them into whatever it is they need to be turned into. Or if they're, fresh fruits and vegetables, just washing them, taking care of them, all of that. They're distributed to people so that those people can then consume them. And also part of the system is just access. So being able to go to your grocery store or a bodega somewhere and get that food. And then there's waste recovery, a part of this process. And it is cyclical, like I was saying before, and all of these are feeding into each other and interacting in different ways. So it's not this process that's step by step. And represented by the colorful arrows, we have many economic, environmental, social, and other factors like political influences that are often indirectly influencing how these parts are operating. Are there any questions about that? Pretty simple. Cool. Okay, so for example, farmer May might go from growing a lot of yellow tulip varieties to growing exclusively red ones because these varieties are more heat resistant, for example. So that would be an environmental influence, although it's totally fictional. But something like that could happen in real life, just changing how things are grown. So for the majority of our food and farming and justice series will focus on production. So we're not really getting at all into these other pieces. And it's environmental and other influences. So we're going to ignore largely like those social ones, economic ones, because that's not the focus of what we're talking about. So the red is just showing the things that we're going to focus on together. Okay. So the next definition is agriculture. And so this is where we have poll everywhere, where I'm going to ask you to answer this question. So you can either text where it says text Martha WILLIA 680 to the number 22333 to join, and then you can text your answer. I'm also going to get the link so that you can do it online as well. So just give me a moment to do that. Step over. So you should also be able to click the link in the chat to answer it too. Please let me know if you have any issues doing that. Question is, how would you define agriculture? Ooh, the cultivation of crops for a practical purpose. Farming, that's a good one. Cultivation of land. How food is grown. Production of food. Producing crops. All right, so we're seeing a lot of the same answers now. And these are pretty good responses. This one includes animals, cool, and other human uses. So what happens though when we ask Google the same question of defining agriculture? Well, if you look at it, it says the science or practice of farming, which a lot of you said, including the cultivation of soil for the growing of crops and the rearing of animals to provide food, wool, and other products, which sounds great. So then I looked up, okay, well, what does farming mean? So because I'm seeing that it says farming within that, so let's make sure we totally understand what that means. But if you look that up, Merriam-Webster says farming is the practice of agriculture, which is confusing. So, well, these are two different sources, so maybe we'll see less circular logic and reasoning if we see what else is out there. So Cornell Law School says that agriculture refers to the act of farming and raising livestock. So we have that farming definition again. But Oxford Languages, who define agriculture in the slide before this, also defines farming as the activity or business of growing crops and raising livestock. Okay, so now we have a more specific definition. But there are others out there, like this one from the State of Vermont Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets, that defines agriculture, according to the section 2.16 of the required agricultural practices, as the cultivation or use of land for growing food, fiber, Christmas trees, maple sap, or horticulture, viticulture, cultural and orchard crops, or B, the raising, feeding, or management of livestock, fish, poultry, or bees, so on. And the definition actually goes on for 6 more parts. And then there is my favorite definition of agriculture. I would say that this one would be the one to remember because it seems the most encompassing, where it says agriculture is the science, art, or practice of cultivating the soil, producing crops, and raising livestock, and in varying degrees the preparation, marketing of those resulting products. And that's from Merriam-Webster. These all sound like great definitions. They all have their strengths and weaknesses. They could all have merit. I mean, we can say that Farmer May is engaged in agriculture, or that she practices farming because she grows crops. But of all the sources offering definitions, who is the best or clearest authority on this? Is there only one? So you could argue that the USDA, or the United States Department of Agriculture, is that authority, because that's the group that's usually having all these regulations. They're enforcing them. They have all these great programs out there for people. They have a major influence on farming in the US, right? So what is their definition of agriculture and farming? They actually do not have one at all. There is no official agriculture or farming definition with the USDA. They don't choose to define it. In fact, there isn't a universal definition at all of agriculture. In a 2017 paper based on work that is supported by the National Institute of Food and Agriculture of the U.S. Department of Agriculture, that in their HAPS project, that agriculture has been defined in terms of subfields such as sustainable or organic agriculture or agricultural literacy, but not more broadly. But does this even matter? Like, why am I harping on definitions and who defines them and all of that? Do we need one from the USDA? Can't Farmer May keep farming just totally unbothered by the lack of a definition by an agency she didn't create and she doesn't necessarily interact with? It really isn't rhetorical. I do want you to answer that. So this is another poll everywhere, so you can use the same link in the chat, and I'm going to make sure that this one is activated. A lot of maybes and no's. No one's saying yes. Okay. So you told me yes, no, or maybe, but could you defend your answer? Why do you feel that maybe it is or it isn't if you clicked no? Now it takes a minute to type out your thoughts, so that's why I'm waiting a little bit longer. Ooh, receiving support, that's a good one. Oh, someone put in the chat, it could affect legislation or subsidies. They might depend on a clear definition. It's another good answer. Most people know it, so you don't need one. That's why someone said no. Makes sense. Different words, so they have different meanings. People use them interchangeably. Okay. So people have different takes on why it does or doesn't matter. And it seems like those who feel like it doesn't matter is because people are still doing what they do. People are still using it. People know what it means, so it doesn't really matter that much. Or one that's saying that there's too many nuances, there's too many things about it, where you can't really have one concise definition. So when I asked myself this question of does it matter, before I used to say yes, but now I say that it might matter, maybe. If you are in the no, this does not matter group, you may be wondering, okay, why would it matter? How could this possibly affect someone like Farmer May or really anyone else in New York State farming or elsewhere in the US? Those would be very good questions in my opinion. And to answer those questions, I want to look at a real world example of a USDA program. I'm seeing something in the chat. Oh, someone said they didn't see another poll question. Okay, sometimes you have to exit out and come back. So on the next one, we can try that. And if it doesn't work, we can keep looking. Thank you for that. So looking at the beginning farmers and ranchers loans that are offered by the USDA Farm Service Agency, or FSA, you'll hear a lot for short. They're acknowledging how expensive it is to start and continuously operate a farm, so that they're offering several types of loans to those beginning farmers. So being able to access land and financial capital, which is really another way of just saying money, through these loan programs. But if you go onto the FSA website, because you're growing and you want support for your farm or your garden or whatever that you're growing, or raising animals on, when you go to their frequently asked questions, which is pretty immediate on the page, it defines beginning farming, because I'm sure everyone asks, well, who counts as a beginning farmer or rancher? And the definition impacts the likelihood of whether someone like, say, our Farmer May would get one of these loans if she were to apply for it. So we can look at Farmers May's operation. So let's recall what I said earlier about Farmer May. I said that she owns and is the principal operator of a 2-acre organic no-till New York State farm. We know that she's been in operation for 5 years, so that's what I said at the beginning as well. And then just for the intent and purpose of this example, we'll also say that when we read through all of the eligibility, we saw that she fit the farm operating loan specifically, met those requirements. So if we go back to the definition of beginning farmer to see if May can truly apply for this loan, let's see what happens. So the first criterion being has operated a farm or a ranch for more than 10 years. Or has not operated. So she's been doing this for 5 years. This is the only farm she's ever had. So she fits that criterion. Another one says does not own a farm or ranch greater than 30% of the average size farm in the county as determined by the most current census for agriculture at the time the loan application is submitted. So I said that she owns, this is a 2-acre farm. So if we're looking at the most recent USDA agricultural census, which is from 2017, although they just completed one, so that data should be coming out probably in the next 2 years. The average farm at that time was actually 28 acres. So 30% of 28 is 8.4. She has 2 acres, so she meets this qualification too. Great. Okay, and the last one we said, second to last one, does she meet the loan eligibility requirements of the program she's applying for? She fit the farm operating loan, so that one works too. And the last one, it says substantially participates in the operation. Well, we said that she is the owner and she's the principal operating, meaning she's the main person growing and running everything on the farm. So that means that she fits this too. So looking at this, it seems like, well, she definitely fits it, right? Again, maybe. And you're wondering why we went through every criteria, and all the criteria she meets it, like what could possibly be wrong? Well, again, we're looking at this word farm though. We kept saying she has a farm, but what does the USDA mean when they say farm? Well, we're looking at the USDA Economic Research Service, or ERS. Very specifically defines a farm as any place that produced and sold, or normally would have produced and sold, at least $1,000 of agricultural products during a given year. So the FSA wouldn't even consider Farmers May operations a real farm if she wasn't producing and selling at least $1,000 of agricultural products in the way of getting a loan and doing everything else for that. She would also need to have something called a farm number. But because we said that our farmer May was able to apply for this very specific type of like farm operator loan, she does have these things. But what about all the producers who don't have a farm number and who aren't selling things, like community gardeners who are just there addressing like food security? Well, the USDA comprises 29 agencies staffed by tens of thousands of people. On their website, they actually say they have 100,000 employees, and they're administering many programs throughout the entirety of the United States. And each of those programs has their own requirements and may utilize their own definitions for agricultural operations, farming practices, and so on that can either help producers of specific demographics like a farmer May that we keep using. But these same program requirements and definitions may also limit access to producers who really need the resources these programs provide. And sure, there may be other programs targeted for them, but how far-reaching are these programs? When these programs applications are really labor intensive, meaning that they require like hours of work of gathering all this information and putting it together, who has the time for that? If you're out there, especially growing full-time, or you're growing as part-time and you have another full-time job, so many other things going on, you're in school. Does this make some people more advantaged than others when you're considering how these definitions are used and implemented? Well, many of people have asked these same questions, and many other questions are around the same idea. And unfortunately, our food system is fraught with different problems like systemic racism, wealth inequality, and more. Not always intentional from everyone participating in every system, but the way that they're built and the way that people have implemented them. So what you're seeing on this slide are just some of the headlines that speak to some of these issues. So people not being able to access resources that they want, not being able to get loans, even the USDA writing reports about, hey, maybe if we use these definitions differently, they change what statistics that we get from our ag census and who's eligible for what programs at all. So to deal with this and this issue of, who gets what, who has access to what, we have this concept of food justice. So this definition that sounds complicated says to achieve equity and fairness in relation to food system impacts in a different, more just and sustainable way for food to be grown, produced, made accessible, and eaten. And this can be integrated into every part of our food system. So basically, this is just saying that our food system isn't always fair. It could be fair. And there are ways that we can do things differently so that people can actually grow the things that they want to grow, have access to the things that they want to have access to, and eat the things that they need to eat. So if we're looking at our farmer May again as an example, she can contribute to food security. That would be a major part of food justice, which is this idea of everyone at all times having access to what they need to have for food-wise, to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food that meets their dietary needs, which is really speaking a little bit more to food sovereignty, so that ability of being able to eat what's culturally appropriate for you, that's nutritious for you, and food preferences for an active and healthy lifestyle. So how is Farmer May able to do this? Well, if she's growing things for her community, she can listen to her community. She could ask her community, well, what is it that you want to grow? What is it that you want me to grow? What is it that you would like to be able to eat? What are the things that are important to you in your culture? Getting to know the people around in her community. And if she's not providing directly to that community right around her, like whatever her demographics, like whatever the area is, like knowing the people who are consuming the food that she's growing. To make sure that it is culturally appropriate, and she's growing that all year round, making sure that other members of the community can actually get to the food, so she can grow it and she can put it in a grocery store. But if people can't get to the grocery store because the grocery store is really far away, that's also her ability to do things. I think someone accidentally came up with you. And although Farmer May is this fictional character who's doing these things, there are people doing this kind of work in real life. This is not a fake thing that doesn't exist, and things people aren't actually doing. And although I'm like a part of this group and this like network that I'm showing here, this isn't me just plugging it to say that this is a great org. I want you to figure that out on your own. I want you to just know that there are people out here doing so much of this work. So if we're looking at this ecosystem here that exists in New York State, and honestly, in a lot of ways in the Northeast region, we have different organizations doing education and training. So Farm School and Soulfire, for example, which are in New York City and like Rensselaer County or like that Albany area, if you're going a little further up and over to the east, are teaching people how to grow, like hands-on, teaching people different cultural practices that are used to grow food and all of that kind of thing, and making sure that people have access to that education, because there are a lot of people who want to grow but don't know how to. Black Farmers United of New York State, that's my organization, and we're focused a lot on policy and advocacy, but we also are doing different types of education within that. So knowing about something like the Farm Bill, which is this massive piece of legislation that comes out every 4 years, which is actually set to be renewed, hopefully, or reauthorized this year in September. But we're also doing skill shares and teaching people, again, more hands-on things of how to learn, how to grow. So that concept of food justice, people having the ability to grow their own food. So if I want to grow tomatoes and I want to grow beans at my home, I know how to do that. But within that ecosystem, there's also land access. So this concept of being able to get land, so you know how to grow things, and now you just need a place to grow. And if you're thinking about Long Island and Nassau County in particular, there's a lot of suburban areas. It almost sometimes feels like peri-urban, meaning like right on the outside of the New York City. So there isn't a lot of land around. So being able to actually get that land and do something with it, and be able to have the sunlight necessary to grow your crops or whatever it is that you're doing, to raise animals, have space for that. That's important and also part of food justice. And in this case, there's an organization called the Northeast Farmers of Color Land Trust that's focused on getting some of our most historically marginalized groups, meaning just people over the history of this country who have systematically, meaning intentionally, left outside of different programs that are helpful. So this group is focused on making sure that one of those like very broad groups has access to that. And then there's capital and market. So you know how to grow, you're growing on a farm or land, whatever it is, it's your small garden, it's your large farm. And now you need to be able to get those products that you've grown, that you've produced, over to other places. So we have organizations like Carbon Hill Food Project, or Black Farmer Fund, who's making sure that you have the money to even do that. Or maybe you have the land, you know how to grow, but you don't have any money to buy seeds, you don't have money to buy large equipment like a tractor. So then all of these organizations will work together constantly to make sure that people have access to what they have. And this is happening focused on New York State. Some of our organizations are New York State only, but also in the larger, broader Northeast. But that is just one set of organizations doing one set of things. Then you have organizations like Heal Food Alliance, which is focused a lot on food justice as well. And they're working to do a lot of things focused on policy and making sure that people just have access again to food, have control over their food systems. And then there are organizations like the National Black Food Justice Alliance, which is represented by that logo on the right. And then there's also Rewild. And maybe you don't think of your work as being food justice, or you don't think of it as being like this justice-oriented organization, which it absolutely is, and it's a part of that, because environmental justice, that concept of people having access to like clean air, the people being able to have wildlife at all, to have different organisms there that they're used to, that are native to the area, like all of that is related, because it's all about the sustainability of our systems. We want to see these systems continuously feeding into each other, supporting each other. So you're a part of this movement as well. And that makes these different forms of what we're generally called social justice, or whatever it is that you want to call it, are linked, and there's no way of separating that. And we're all working together, whether we immediately see that or not. And I want to show that because of this work that's done collaboratively, whether we know it or not, we're focused on different parts of the same system. that have led to really important definitions. Like there's a group that was working with an assembly member a year or two ago on having a definition of what like food apartheid or what a food desert is, and why that matters, because like I was saying before, if Farmer May decides that she wants to grow something and then for her community, and then our community can't get to the food, then that community doesn't eat. So the idea that people are living in areas where they just can't access food because it's too far away, or the food, if we're thinking about the idea of a food swamp, meaning that there are foods that, you know, you can eat, but then they're really high in sugar, they're really high in oils and fats and things that are good in moderation, but when you have a lot of them, they're not doing so well for your body. So having that definition to be able to say like, hey, this is a program that is focused specifically on food apartheid, and that concept of something that is man-made, because it's not as though, you know, people just by chance happen to be in an area that doesn't have food and access to it. And someone's putting in the chat, adding to it, that Plants a Row for the Hungry Port Washington's entire mission is food justice, which is great. And this person B is happy that Rewild Long Island highlights this important cause, which is wonderful. Again, we're all a part of this. And then another term that has come up because of people doing this work is the socially disadvantaged farmer. So this concept that there are groups of people who have been subject to racial or ethnic prejudice. So this idea that you can't have this because you are different in this way. So the fact that that's even a definition at all, but it was not always a definition, is a big deal, because that means that there are programs, which I can name so many that recently that have come out with different grants where it's like, okay, this money is going towards groups that already have it extremely hard. Not saying that other people don't struggle, because everyone is struggling in some way, shape, or form, but this is a group that we know that we've done wrong by. So let's do something to make sure that they have what everyone else has, more of that equity. Then there's this concept of a distressed farmer, which you hear a lot in cannabis law, which is pretty irrelevant to what we're talking about in terms of food. But again, it's all a part of this larger concept of food justice and everything that is connected to one another. Cool. So a lot of that work that I mentioned is policy work, and I know I have like a bit of a bias and a slant towards that because I'm really involved in a lot of policy work, and I think it's really important to just give us more room to do this kind of really beautiful work that everyone's doing. But it's just a small part of food justice. There's so many other pieces to it. If you believe in it, there are 5 other parts of systems change, and this is actually from something called the Youth Power Coalition. So this means that there are practices. So these are things that we're doing as people. These are things that are structural. These are things that are things that we're doing with each other, the things that we're doing on a daily basis. There are policies, so policies are informing those practices. So you might have a policy that says that, you know, you must have whatever amount of acreage before we're considering you a farm, or the whole idea that you have to have like $1,000 worth of agricultural products that you're selling. And then your practice might be, well, because of that, we interact with these people very differently, and now we're not giving them as many resources. So those are like more structural things where people are just following what's already in place, whether they're the ones who created it or agree with it or not. Then there are things that are dealing with different types of relationships that you have going on, so trying to change those things. So having the relationships that you have to food, the connections that you have to food, power dynamics, the fact that you see a person, they have, you know, whatever amount of power, they're your educator, so you're assuming now that this person is the authority of everything, and now you're just listening to this person, even if this person isn't necessarily right, and you can challenge that. So thinking about that way of making this change in food systems. And then mental models, which I would say is connected to that. All of these things, of course, are implicit, that the idea that you're an authority figure, therefore what you're saying is always correct, which is not true. We're humans, we're fallible, and they may be correct a lot of the time, but they might not be correct all the time, or sometimes they're not correct at all. I mean, it depends. So I wanted to show you things that, you know, more tangible examples of things that are policy. Those are the things that people usually are gravitating towards because they're really concrete. You can see them, they're obvious. You can say, well, this is no longer a law. You can really like quantify your success there. But there are other parts of this that you can get into, whether it be that you're deciding, if you're thinking about sustainability, that you're going to use a sustainable practice of farming or gardening that allows you to have a more sustainable operation. That's something that you can do on your own. You can make sure that there is a law that says that you can use land that's sitting there doing absolutely nothing for growing because you decided that that makes sense and that's helping your community. Any questions about that? I know that food justice and food systems are a big topic. Making sense? I know sometimes it takes like a day or two to let things sit in. Just wanted
So,
to
one comment I wanted to make, right?
yes.
Definitely, I want, as our students start designing a garden, and we'll later just forming you into groups of 3s and 4s and starting to think in terms of what you want to do. I think a lot of what Martha you're saying goes to purpose. Like, what are you going to use that land for? So even though you're doing a mental exercise, right? Who does it benefit? Who's going to benefit from it? Is it going to be birds and bees? Is it going to be pollinators? Is it going to be people? Is it going to be everything? So all of that goes directly to how and what you're going to grow. So this goes to purpose, the heart of why are you doing this, right? Is it aesthetic enjoyment? Is it, right? What do you want? What is the message and what is the value that is coming out of the land and your labor?
Absolutely, 100%. Totally agree with that. So just getting at the why, right? So if you're anything like me and you're like, okay, but we went from talking about food systems to definitions to food justice, okay, and there isn't, the USAA doesn't have their own definition, but what is the definition? Like, give me a definition. I totally get that. Is this ideal? You know, is this one by Merriam-Webster that I personally really like the one that we should follow? Well, maybe because it focuses a lot on products, which is something to be consumed. But like Raju was saying, if you're growing something and it's really just for the aesthetics of it, or you're trying to bring in pollinators, it's not really a product that you're creating. And then it's also focused on marketing those products and getting those products to someone. And maybe that's not your whole purpose here. You're not trying to make money here. You're just trying to feed your community. You're just trying to bring in these pollinators. Which raises the question of like, should agriculture be defined by commodities, these things that we're selling and buying and moving about and making money off of? And also, should they be focused solely on what we're doing for people? Do the animals not matter? I mean, I have my own thoughts on these questions, but it doesn't mean that I am the one who comes up with it. It doesn't mean that the people with the most experience should be the ones creating all of these things. I mean, we have these programs because we're looking at this next generation. So the future, however you want to look at it, whatever you believe, is supposed to be shaped, or I believe should be shaped by all of us, not just some of us. So that is my presentation.